Take it away, Pat.
All right, I'm just going to introduce everybody and say, first of all, welcome to Sing Toronto. We're delighted that you have just chosen to spend your evening with us. Last night's business seminar was absolutely riveting and very helpful, and I'm sure you will find tonight's as well. We have three people who are on the panel, and we'll take your questions, of course, as we go through the seminar and at the end. J.M. Erlendson, who you heard speak for a moment, is the founder and manager of the Sing Festival. He has a long pedigree in a cappella, as in three a cappella groups, the Rock Singers, Countermeasure, and Beat Sync, as well as having worked in the university a cappella scene when he was in university and working as a professional musician since he was 10 years old, including as an award-winning songwriter. So and in order to keep his groups running, he does a lot of fundraising and grant writing. So that he has a lot of experience. Dan Broome is the Director of Strategy and Engagement for the Sing A Cappella Festival. He has lots of different experience in finding money. He worked with True North Records from very early on until he became the Vice President of Administration. He is a part-time instructor at Harris Institute, where he teaches 6 marketing courses and has developed numerous term assignments that are now integral to the current curriculum at Harris Institute. He was the senior business representative for the Toronto Musicians Association, dealing with top-level organizing governance, the board and policy member relations, contracts, careers, issues, etc. And he's been a board member in City of Toronto local arts service organizations, Scarborough Arts, as well as many other organizations, and has taken on the leadership of Sing. Tom will tell you more about Patreon. Patreon is a way of raising money for your group. Tom Werring is joining us to talk about exactly that, how to find money for your group in a different way. So all of these bring different experiences to the table, and I know that you'll find it valuable, and I'll turn it over to JM.
Actually, I'm gonna pass this over to Dan to get us started. So, but just as a little preamble, thank you so much for everyone coming today. One of the big parts of helping to sustain an organization is helping to find funding, and today we're going to be talking all about that. That's why this session is called "Show Me the Money." Well, Dan, why don't you start us help us show us the money? Let's get started with a little bit of preamble on what we do and why we do it.
Sure, and I would reiterate the thanks that have been said. For those of you who are joining as musicians or artists, we're glad we're here, and we'll hope you'll take home some useful advice. And for those of you just attending as part of the festival as fans of a cappella music, I hope you find this evening's conversation informative. So whether you're a musical artist or a group, if you're just starting out and learning your way forward, or perhaps you're a semi-professional artist, or a member of a musical collective working locally in your community, or perhaps at the grassroots level, or perhaps even across a broader geographic region. Or maybe your aspirations are to turn your creative passion into a full-time career, and you aspire to actually earn a living through music creation and performance. You may be looking my screen just dropped there. You may be looking to fund a creative project or endeavor, or to deliver something to enlighten and connect your local community. Or you just may be looking for operational stability in terms of your artistic pursuits, at whatever level they are. Perhaps you're seeking financial support to grow your audience. You want to grow the reach of what you're doing collectively or creatively, or you're looking to expand your career. Maybe you're seeking world domination in the global music market. Whatever the case, at some level, the question, you're going to have to set out and think about the financial aspects of your pursuits. How are you going to do this? How do you pay for this? How do you make this work? And so you're going to have to deal with that and figure it out. So as a jump off point, I'm just going to quickly talk about how we think about or review some ways to think about funding or bringing in finances. What we're really talking about as it relates to art and entertainment, there's kind of 2 streams to think about. There's project capitalization. How do we capitalize, get finances to pay for projects? And then there's operations capitalization. How do you pay for the general operation of your infrastructure that supports whatever it is you do, whether it's put on live shows or make recordings or a combination of those and more. So for most businesses, most businesses who endeavor to seek some sort of financing, the two standard approaches, which I'm sure you're all aware of, are the ideas of investment. That is, borrow some money from family and friends, get them to invest in what you do for some ownership. We see the idea of forming a formal business structure with partners where there's a comprehended business model, where there's going to be some risk and some return for putting money forward. In the modern age, we see other versions of financing through investment strategies coming forward. Things like GoFundMe or Kickstarter are online investment platforms that are ways for you to raise funds or raise capitals. And then, of course, the other second traditional way would be something like loans. The idea of an institutional financial loan, banks, or again, the idea of borrowing money from your friends or family. The arts, unfortunately, just the very nature of it, and the music industry, which is where my background is in specifically, this is seen often as high risk. That is, there's a certain uncertainty that goes for banks with pursuing with the arts, because in a lot of cases, the understanding of the value of the asset isn't immediate, right? You buy a house, you know what the house is worth. You write an album, it's hard to predict what the immediate or long-term value of that will be. So thankfully in Canada, music and culture is seen as a valued investment in that it generates community action. It generates employment opportunities and spending in local and regional and national economies, right? A band goes on tour, people go out to see it, they're spending money. A festival happens somewhere and people travel around to go see it, they're moving money through the local economy. All of this has value. It has value as a connector for communities, and it has value in terms of getting money flowing in the economy. And the great news about most arts and most entertainment is that's local money being spent in the community in a large part. You go out and see a show, you buy dinner, local dollars generated, local money being spent. So arts, fortunately, I think in the Canadian approach to arts has taken the idea that they see it as a driver. Arts and culture is an economic driver. On a broader scale, at a certain level, it's also seen as a driver of potentially bringing revenue into the country from other nations or around the world. Every time a Canadian artist goes somewhere and tours and generates enough money to pay off the cost of the profit, to pay off the cost of the tour and generate a profit on the tour through tour receipts, ticket sales, or merchandise, that money comes back into the country. And that's important. That's also really, really important. It is a driver, not just of local economy, it's a driver of global economy, bringing money back to Canada. And so for that reason, Canada at multiple levels of government, for various reasons that I just mentioned, has seen arts as an investment, has seen it delivering value. The average changes, but historically, the average is set somewhere for every dollar spent on culture, it generates somewhere between $2 to $4 in return. Pretty good deal. Spend a dollar, make two. Right? That seems to be a good way to approach business. So for these reasons, again, Canada has a robust community of arts funding organizations at the local level, something like the Toronto Arts Foundation here in Toronto. At the provincial level, something like Ontario Creates as an example. And at the national level, something like Factor being an example, the Foundation to Assist Canadian Talent on Record. These funding organizations offer a variety of funding in the form of both grants and loans, often to wide spectrums of styles of music, a cappella, blues, jazz, hip hop, pop, rock, country, and for a variety of possible uses. Maybe you want to make a demo recording, you want to make a full-length recording, you want to do a video production, you're looking for tour support to take your performances further afield from your local performing area. Perhaps it's marketing support. There's all sorts of various streams of funding available to various styles of music. It is both economically wide in the areas it attempts to assist, and musically and culturally diverse in the areas that, in the type of things it tries to support. So all of these organizations have been crucial to the developing of a vibrant Canadian arts, culture, and music industries. And what's really interesting, and we're at a fairly interesting time, and that's why I'm really excited to have Tom here. With the rise of global connectivity through the internet, we see a further expansion of funding possibilities through a couple of things. Number one, I mentioned earlier, the idea of investment through crowdfunding, Kickstarter or GoFundMe. But the other thing, it's a return to something that actually is really, really old. It goes back to the earliest days of the European tradition of music and courts of aristocracies, and that's the idea of patronage, right? And where with something like, you know, what Tom's going to speak about with Patreon, these online platform, it's an online platform that it's able to assist artists in pursuit of their financial operational stability, community and fan connection, and direct connection of a financial relationship between both the artist and the actual community of fans and supporters. And so that's a really, I think, exciting development, because it's not at a local scale, it's not at a national scale, it's potentially at a global scale. It goes in line with where we are, I think, around the world. The idea of act locally, think and imagine globally, the possibility of reaching beyond where you exist. So where do you start when it comes to funding? Well, before you start into exploring where and what type of financial funding opportunity you should pursue, I would recommend the following 6 things. I'm going to go through 6 quick points before I pass it on to JM. The first one is self-assessment. Where are you at today? What does your operation look like today? How does it run? Do you have a web page? What does your social media presence look like? You know, really, anytime you're going to build or attempt to build something through a funding organization or an agency or through any sort of platform that might assist you through that, you have to take stock of your inventory. You have to understand your infrastructure. Maybe there are some holes. Maybe there are some things you need to develop before you take to that step. So, for example, right now, if you were working in the area of hip hop and you did not have a TikTok page and you weren't thinking about TikTok, there's a platform infrastructure you need to think about, because that's where that industry has moved. And so learning that and understanding that and assessing that, so you've kind of got the infrastructure to make the most successful use of funding in terms of loans or grants, should you achieve it, should you be granted it. So the second thing, and it's related to the all of the infrastructure piece, is metrics. How are you currently measuring your success? Are you tracking your audience, how many people you're playing to, how many tickets you're selling, how many streams you've got, how many social media followers you've got? And not only can you give me or give someone a number today, can you demonstrate growth? Can you say, you know, last year we had, you know, so you might have a small number. You might have 2,000 followers. You know what sounds better than saying, well, this year we've got 4,000 followers? We had a 100% increase in followers last year, right? This is really kind of crucial. But in order to start playing with the language and maximizing the effect of your application, which JM's going to talk more about, you really do have to start thinking about, what are your metrics today? Gather them together and and get that figured out. Third piece, what's your story? Interesting things get attention, and that goes for funding boards. I've in my career, I have brought in over $1.5 million in funding loans, grants, and tax credits, arts tax credits, etc., and sat on multiple boards that have granted funds, and sat on juries, etc. And ultimately, the content, the quality has to be there. It has to be an interesting idea, but there also has to be some sense of a story. There has to be some sense of storytelling and progression. So that third piece, I think, is really important to figure out where you are in your story, and imagine where that story is going to go, and then make that activity you're pitching for in terms of funding part of that story. Which goes to the fourth point. What is it you want to achieve? What is that thing that you're setting out to achieve? Clearly define what it is, and then relate that back to the metrics. Okay, we want to go out and tour, and we're going to go for tour support. Great. How are you measuring that success? How are you going to show that? Have you developed that capability? My best advice to anybody in any sort of pursuit at this level, professional, semi-professional, otherwise, if you're looking to grow or seek stability, an operational strategic and or business plan is a worthwhile exercise. And you don't have to create a really, really robust 5-year multi-page, 200-page document. 5 or 6 pages kind of outlining, even if it's just for the year, what your operational, strategic, and business plan strategy is, will bring focus to what you're talking about in your grant. Fifth piece of the equation before you start looking broader, I would suggest, or before you start applying, what funding is available, or what approach best serves your needs. So if you're talking audience growth, is that best achieved through driving traffic to your website? Is it best achieved by connecting more with live audiences? Is it best achieved by developing more platforms to extend your reach? What is it that's going to achieve that goal? The sixth thing is, what is the funder's mandate? It's important as you look at each of the funders, what are they doing and why? Is it about community building? Is it about content building? Just as an example, Factor was an organization that was born out of a need when CanCon regulations came in, Canadian content regulations came in from the CRTC, mandating that Canadian radio stations play an X percentage of Canadian-made content. There was concern that there was a shortage of content. So to drive that up, a fund was created to help musicians create more Canadian music for potential airplay. So it's important you understand that. Don't just read the application. Read the about, read the mission statements, read why they exist and what they're setting out to achieve. And I actually did have one more thing I actually counted wrong. It wasn't 6, it was 7. Reporting. Understand and figure out before you start applying for things, do you have the capability to properly do it? Certain funding does require more robust things. For example, certain funds require, depending on what you're doing and what level you're at, they might require audited year-end statements. They might require a reviewed statement by an accounting firm at the end of the year if it's an operational fund. So just be aware of the reporting implications before reporting, because you could go through a lot of heartache to realize you're not going to be able to fill on your end of the obligation if you get the fund. If it's a fit, if all of those things are a fit and you've done all that work, go forward. And the last piece of advice I'd give you before handing it over to JM, start small, right? You need to develop a track record. With any funding body, you need to develop a track record and a reputation. So don't start by looking to achieve and ask for the biggest fund of money they have available through a grant or a loan. Start small. Start small and within incremental steps so you can show your ability to report properly. You can show your ability to fulfill on your side of what you set out to do. And hopefully, as you grow with the level of funding, they will grow as part of your story. There's the old adage of self-discovery in the music business, that the people love the bands that they discover most. And there's a certain excitement that I've seen with my participation within funding bodies and juries, that when they see somebody that they said, yeah, that sounds good, that's a good plan, let's give it money. When they see that generating, there's a self-reward there. And the system, it's an energy it's an ecosystem, right? And that energy builds the positiveness both within the bodies that run that funding. And it creates more active participation about the already established industry within that, to want to be part of it, to want to continue to support and help those newer players who are trying to grow to the level of the players that are already there. And go, I remember I was at that level, and I was so glad I gave that organization or that artist a grant, because look at how far they've come. Right? There's a real self-reward in that, and that's part of the excitement of creative community. You want to succeed, but you want to see others succeed as well. There's a certain joy in that. So with that, I'll hand it over to JM.
Wonderful, Dan, and thank you so much for the context and advice. For reference, my name is JM. Well, Dan comes from the organizational funding perspective and sitting on juries. I come from the artist perspective. I might have the sing hat on, but I'll take it off for a moment and talk about what I do for my various groups that I perform with, particularly groups Countermeasure, Beat Sync, and the Ruach Singers, all in a cappella, but all who strive to get grants. And particularly, we're actually fairly successful with grants. Not that I'm big upping myself, but we've managed to figure out we've figured how to make it sort of year over year sustainable for the group to do all its projects, go where it needs to go, and raise hundreds of thousands of dollars to make all that happen at the pleasure of the governmental organizations that we rely on. So how do we do that, and how do you get started? So I just wanted to share my screen with folks and talk about what it takes to actually go through applying for a grant. So first and foremost, what are grants and where am I going to find them? Dan talked at a high level about the idea of finding grants from different types of arts councils. Well, let's walk through them. I'm based in Toronto, Ontario. You could be based wherever you are, but I guarantee you if you're in Canada, you'll find that there are lots of different programs that will be at various different levels. And I'll start with our governmental support programs that I wanted to share about. So let's go with wherever you are in Canada, this will apply to you. This is Canada Council for the Arts, CCA or canadacouncil.ca. They have a lot of different grants available. Okay, that's enough on that. A lot of different grants that are available for you to look at in a bunch of different buckets. They might seem a little bit intimidating, but you can navigate through them by simply clicking on program components and finding the ones that are relevant to you. They fund things like the creation projects through something called concept realization. You can build things that haven't existed before that you're coming up with. And they fund pretty extensively people who are looking to create artistic projects, things that wouldn't necessarily have the same sort of marketability and saleability that would generate profits, but instead increase the fidelity of Canadian arts. You'll find that Canada Council also has some of the largest project sizes that are available to you. So as Dan said, you may not be able to go after those right away. You'll have to grow into them, but they're a great place to go if you're looking to create very specialized art, things that aren't really covered, and also to travel. So they have arts across Canada, which is fantastic for touring. It's taken the group, my various groups, to all across our nation, and of course arts abroad, which is actually a relatively large amount of money, depending on how big your group is, or if you're a solo artist. This can be a pretty substantial sort of chunk of change towards where you need to go. And of course, those travel grants were blacked out for a lot of the COVID periods, but they are coming back. And in doing so, there's going to be a lot of subscribership, I understand, but it'll be a great opportunity for you to fund the first tours out after COVID. If you are located in Ontario, although I guarantee you wherever province you're in will have something like this, if you're still in Canada, you'll find the Ontario Arts Council. This is a little bit less of a high risk or sort of stringent evaluation criteria. Ontario Arts Council a little easier to get. Their grants are a little smaller, but they do support a ton, particularly in the music business. And I can tell you where we've been successful in the past are things like music creation projects to commission new pieces. So if you're a choir or a chorus or somebody who's getting music written for you, you can get a fairly substantial chunk of change to help you generate new music for your group. It's fantastic to help fund composers who are living in your area. And remember, a lot of these arts councils want to make sure the people they're paying are within the region that they're funding. So for CCA, you're going to want to find Canadian artists. For OAC or Ontario Arts Council, you'll want to find Ontario-based artists or projects happening within Ontario that would pay Ontario musicians to do things like commissioning, as well as they can help you with creating concerts. So if you have a concert series, or this is a particularly important one for groups who just want to get started, rehearsal and repertoire development is probably the lowest hanging fruit of any grant that you can go against, because it is really all about paying your directors to help you rehearse your material. It's what you're already doing, and as long as you have a good vision, you have a good idea of what it's going to do for you, you've got all the things you need in place to make it happen, and a community that you're serving. This is a pretty easy fit for a lot of organizations, and well, it's not a huge amount of money. I think the cap on that is about $5,000 for smaller organizations, semi-professional community organizations. It's still a good chunk of money towards paying a conductor if you're paying a conductor year over year, or if you've got professional staff that it's going to help with. including they also do help with recording and as well as touring. So that's all covered with Ontario-based artists who are touring to represent Ontario. Whereas Canada Council focuses a lot on sort of the arts, the art of things, and the high art that would go into creating things that you wouldn't be able to get otherwise. Ontario Arts Council is all about representation. They want to see Ontario-based projects. They want to see Ontario artists found all over the world, across Canada, and given the sort of spotlight in terms of music creation. So that's where you can really find a lot of love, particularly if you're Ontario based and doing something that will have a lot of exposure. And sort of talking back to what Dan said about something that's going to have a real impact. And I'll talk about that when we look at the actual structure of a grant itself. If you happen to be in Toronto, this is Sing the Toronto Vocal Arts Festival, but I know that a ton of municipalities have their own local grant programs. This is TAC, or the Toronto Arts Council. And I've focused in on the music programs. There's a bunch of music things, including things like annual operating. I wouldn't start out, as Dan said, don't start out with those sorts of things. Most of those are gated behind having to receive a certain number of grants in the past. I don't think it works with TAC like that, but still, you probably have to have a little bit more qualifications or different statuses, like not-for-profit or charity, that are organizational gates in preventing you from necessarily starting with this. But of course, if you want to do music projects like creating concerts or recordings, this is a great place to go. And all of these grants that I've just shown have their own online application systems. And so you're going to want to familiarize yourself with those application systems and in fact, probably pull apart how those questions are laid out, which I'll show you in a couple seconds, to help answer them. One of the tips that I have sort of embedded in this is that you're going to want to have a team behind you to help write these grants. I know it feels daunting as an individual, and it kind of is. I've written a lot of grants solo, and Ironmanning a grant is a tough prospect for a couple of different reasons. The first is that it can be a lot of work. You don't expect to spend less than 20 hours on a grant for the first time, and some grants will ask for a lot more, so 20 sort of person hours to get those things up and running. The second is that the grants do require some specialized knowledge. So somebody has to know how to build a budget. Somebody should be able to create a marketing plan. You should have somebody who's able to create digital collateral that you can share, things like videos, things like your audio recordings. You're going to be used to evaluate your artistic merit on these things. And so you're going to need to bring a team of people, even if the team is 2 or 3, just folks who can focus on the different pieces of the grant. I can tell you my grant writing team right now is 4, and for the groups that I work with, and it's, you know, we segment out what we do, and it's fantastic. We've got somebody who's looking at only copy editing, just is everything right, final checks. We got somebody who only does finances and justifications for budgets and for expenditures and for impacts. We got somebody who only talks artistic integrity and what does it mean. We have somebody who only talks marketing. How are we going to get this out there? And those 4 people put together make a really good team. Find friends to help you. It's really not that hard to get somebody to just take a look over your stuff. And you know who really takes a look over your stuff? If you ask them nicely, your grant officers. And so next to every single grant, you see the names of people who might be able to help you if you need things along the way. They're primarily designed to help provide clarity on the requirements around grants, but they can really dig into things if you contact them early, and I'll talk about that a little bit more when we get to the process. Now, besides these primary things like your arts councils, the national, provincial, and local, you also have specialized organizations, things like Dan talked about before, and I've highlighted them in a bunch of different tabs here. We'll go through them just very briefly, but they might not apply to you depending on what you're doing. Factor is focused specifically on recording. They do other things, but it really focuses and hones in on recording. They care a lot about marketability and how much that it's going to elevate the music recording industry of Ontario, of Canada. And so that one's the kind of thing that your marketing plan is most important. They want to see that you can sell. Once again, the other ones we've talked about, selling isn't as important. Factor, they care that you sell. If you're a corporation or you have a company, you might find love from Ontario Creates or the Ontario Music Investment Fund, used to be called OMDC. And this gives you the ability to do a music creation project that could have multiple components to it. And it's much more comprehensive for a company. So for instance, if you chose to incorporate, rather than simply being an independent artist, you actually have a corporation through which you collect money. You have multiple people who are working for that. You might be able to be qualified for this. And once again, talk to the program officers here. It's fantastic. That's the same with things with like the Government of Canada and the Canadian Music Fund. There's individual initiatives you might be able to take a look at for how they could fund you. If you are a songwriter, you can also qualify. If you're registered with SOCAN, you can qualify for SOCAN-based grants. And so there is the SOCAN Foundation, which does help you to get places, bring your music there. We received SOCAN grants before because we are songwriters as well. So it's good to get your travel assistance. It's temporarily discontinued, but it has been there in the past. And there's a bunch of grants around professional development. If you're an individual artist, look for these grants. They're fantastic to get you things like workshops and residencies in places that you want to grow and learn. And if you're somebody who focuses particularly on business from like a music management perspective, Can Export is also a great way of doing that. So if you're a business that's focused on pumping up artists and promoting them internationally, Can Export can really give you actually a pretty substantial chunk of money towards travel and meeting with clients all over the world who you look to sell your artists to. And once again, those are all things that we've seen success with and that are really good for you. So what does a grant look like? And what do you want to do for it? So first and foremost, grants usually have deadlines. A perfect example of this is you can just find your grant deadlines all through this. You want to make sure that you're looking through all this information and finding all the things associated with it, and then popping open, when is this due? What do I have to do to get it? So all these programs are going to have their deadlines. You're going to want to keep in mind, we usually create a calendar, or people like FYImusicnews.ca has a grant calendar that they just offer for free. You can just find it online. Super, super handy. That first and foremost, when are things due? Secondly is, what are they looking for? So remember that I've just gone through a ton of different possibilities. And by the way, this session is being recorded, so I move fast, but you'll be able to go back and read or re-listen to this to maybe see some of the things you might want. Like a perfect example is, well, who are the eligible applicants? What are we looking for this program to fund? So we want the minimum 3 engagement tour. So we need to know that we have this in place in order to apply. So now we've got deadlines, we have eligibility, and we know who it's going to affect. Now, what do you need to know to give us the money? And that's where we get into these. These are your grant structures and guidelines. Always download your program guidelines and applications form. This is an example of the Canada Council for the Arts Arts Abroad grant, the one that will take you across the world and has for me and my groups for the past 10 years. Here's how much they'll fund. Note that you generally don't want to ask for the maximum if you're literally starting out, they've never heard of you before. And when can you apply? What do you need to do? And then there's a bunch of things. First and foremost, read all these things. How are decisions made? So this is a perfect example of where you'll find a breakdown of how they're going to score you. Impact being a very important thing. Like Dan said, what is this going to do for me? What's this going to do for my community? What's this going to do for Canada? Artistic merit. What can I show off of my work that will let them know that I'm worthy of funding? And feasibility, we always call this the ability to execute. How can I justify this to show that my team is going to be able to actually do what I say I'm going to do in this grant, and that I'm not going to run up against a wall where I simply can't complete the grant as per the conditions that I have agreed to. And then underneath that, you've got information about what questions they're going to ask. The same questions happen all the time. So you're going to get used to asking these or answering these kind of questions, and they're going to ask for the same kind of collateral all the time. So prepare this kind of collateral. What am I doing? What am I representing? Who am I? So briefly describe yourself, your art form, and the activities you wish to undertake. Note that they also have word counts you're going to have to very carefully manage, because a lot of these are text boxes that actually count the characters. So if you write something that's too long, it's not like you can't submit it. It simply just will truncate it, and you won't be able to tell your whole story. So always have a bio, have something that describes your art form, that makes it easy for somebody who doesn't know you to understand what you're trying to do, or who you are, and what you're trying to do. So how will this project help me? How will this project help others? So who am I? What am I trying to do? And how much is it going to cost? So you're going to always run across this over and over again. Every grant's going to ask you for some form of budget. They can look complicated, lots of fields, but you're going to read this through very carefully, one at a time. You can see this says, hey, who am I paying? What am I paying for? What are other costs that I need to do? And feel free to change the labels on these fields to match exactly what you're trying to do. You never want to just try and shoehorn something in. Get as close as possible to reality, and know that what you're doing is just proposing an idea. This doesn't have to be the actual real costs, because there's another thing over here. Update and actual. You see these fields right here? If you get it wrong in your application, you can usually change these values up to like 10% for most grants, or you can shift them around with discussions to your grant officer. So don't be worried if you didn't get it right the exact first time. You can change that stuff after the fact, but get familiar with this, and also respect that a lot of these things will have limits. Like we can't have anything more than 50% supported by public funds or things like that. Or I need to have this field must equal total project costs. So the costs and revenues have to be equal. And oftentimes you'll have to include things like applicant contribution, which is a field that says it's an income. I can just declare that I'm going to fund myself that income. Well, as you might imagine, applicant contribution is going to be a great way of here we are right here, applicant contribution, a great way of shoring up your numbers, because you can always make this number whatever you want it to be. That's how much you commit to, but whatever they fund and whatever you end up doing, you'll adjust based off of that. And then you want to make sure you have lead time on your applications. So we have a number of kicks at the can. Don't just apply for one deadline before you actually have a project going. Apply for as many as it takes. When we have a tour with Countermeasure, we usually try to get the golden rule of 3. We want to be able to have 3 different agencies, and we want to have 3 different kicks at the can for each agency before we try and do a project. So our tour in 2019 to Japan, I started applying in the middle of actually beginning of 2018. I was already applying for that tour in August 2019, so that I would have the spring deadline, the fall deadline, and then the following spring deadline, so I could have 3 kicks at the can for all of my agencies. And that's really important to take a look at. And so that's how I apply for grants. And once again, don't be afraid. You fail at far more grants than you succeed at. And just because I didn't fund you this time, it's a different jury every time. So keep applying. Even if you don't change very much your application, you might get lucky with the second one, or maybe you just got unlucky the first time. And also you can usually get feedback from grant organizations on what you could have done better. So take that in stride and use that as a driver for making your applications better and ultimately getting funding for your groups. But this is all public funding. I want to pass it over to Tom, who can talk a little bit about funding that might come from your fans, your communities, through a platform like Patreon.
For sure. Thanks so much, Jan. To introduce myself, my name is Tom. My title is Creator Partnerships Associate at Patreon. Patreon is a membership and community platform that's founded by a musician, founded by a creator, but the core mission is really just to enable creators with the right tools to establish and grow their own membership community. And so similar to what Dan had mentioned before, this notion of patronage or membership is not necessarily a new concept, right? It's definitely taken on a new sort of context within sort of online communities and ways that you're able to reach a global audience on the internet. And so I think definitely a really, really exciting opportunity for all different types of creators, not only musicians, but the platform is open to podcasters, video creators, visual artists, the like. And so for context and as well, just my appreciation for being part of this panel discussion, my background, even prior to Patreon, I worked in professional development programming for music teachers at Carnegie Hall, and in addition, helped sort of within a grant making program at Carnegie, granting instrumental ensembles. And so I've seen definitely both sides of the equation in terms of artists securing funding for their work. And I definitely think with a platform like Patreon, it's something that is perfect for creators that are sort of folks that are really interested in establishing and growing a community of fans and followers online. The platform was founded in 2013, and since 2013 has grown to over 7 million active patrons. There's over 200,000 creators active and earning on the platform. And as you can imagine, just this last year and a half or so has been really a sea change in creators, especially musicians' perception of a platform like Patreon. We saw over 130% increase in musician signups on the platform since March of 2020. And I think what that really speaks to is just the fact that for musicians specifically, so much of the sort of piece, the largest piece of the revenue pie for so many is live performance and touring. And knowing that that is something in a global pandemic that can evaporate virtually overnight, that understanding that membership and community and being funded directly by your closest and most engaged fans and followers and community members is really incredibly reliable income. And one point that I think I know that Dan had mentioned in his section, just talking about this notion of crowdfunding and sort of platforms like GoFundMe or Kickstarter or Indiegogo. These are all phenomenal platforms that I think do such a great job of sort of project-specific fundraising. So the ability for community members, even family members, fans, followers of your work or your ensemble, being able to chip in $10, $50, $100, $200, in some cases $1,000 for funding for a particular project. And at the conclusion of that fundraise, you have sort of enough capital investment to help fund that work or that project. But I think is a very distinct and separate thing from membership on Patreon. The main sort of differentiator, I would say, is this notion of long-term engagement. What Patreon is really built for, and is what is been proved to be so valuable for so many creators, is this ability to establish long-term recurring monthly revenue. I know what Dan mentioned, sort of operational cost. And for some creators, it's definitely sort of that level of an investment and insurance policy in some instances, where you have this sort of recurring sustainable income that's reliable. It's automatically renewed every month, and you can sort of build your business around that funding as sort of a sustainable foundational piece. But at the end of the day, is just one piece of a larger pie. I think that that membership for a lot of creators is the majority of their income in some instances, but for others, more like established musicians and bands and ensembles, it's just provides them with an added level of security and sort of a cushion to help grow their creative businesses. And so in terms of maybe just highlighting the ways that creators have been utilizing the platform, I think that, as I said, there's over 200,000 creators on the platform, not only musicians, and they all sort of approach membership in their own unique ways. My role at Patreon is really advising creators in sort of conjunction with our data science team to help sort of analyze what are the best practices, what are the best ways for creators to start, grow, and establish their membership businesses. And I think the foundational thing for Patreon specifically is that, and what I would imagine so many creators and musicians find frustrating, or a couple of things with online platforms, namely for a lot of social media platforms like Facebook or YouTube or Instagram, they're driven by an algorithm. They're driven by sort of discovery features that in essence are really serving advertisers first, and not necessarily creators. For Spotify, for a perfect example of a music streaming platform that's paying sort of pennies on the dollar, cents on the dollar per stream. The platforms are really being built for advertisers and to be able to generate ad revenue. And in addition to that sort of frustration for so many creators, the algorithm tends to favor certain pieces of content over others at any given moment. And so I know for a lot of frustrations with creators, ensembles, musicians that are trying to grow a social media presence, that Facebook actually doesn't give you the ability to reach everyone that's following you. In some instances, you actually have to pay Facebook to reach your full audience online. And I think for Patreon, what was so foundational to its founding was trying to build sort of in defiance of that, build a platform that's free of an algorithm that puts creators back in control of their own businesses. So with Patreon, you have full ownership over your patron data, your full ownership over their names and their email addresses, their shipping addresses, all of their pledge history. And we always like to say, like, you can download an Excel spreadsheet of all of that data and leave the platform at any time if you'd like. We really our primary focus is serving creators first, and making sure that they have all of the tools that they need to establish their businesses. And so sort of the ways that some creators are utilizing it, of course, with so many different musicians on the platform, there's creators that have, in some instances, millions of fans. There's like global superstars that are utilizing Patreon and are earning some pretty sustainable revenue from the platform. But on the sort of other side of the coin, there's even more smaller semi-professional, professional ensembles and groups that are sort of using the platform, but maybe have different needs or different goals in mind. I think that community development piece is a big one for some of the smaller, more emerging groups and musicians. Just being able to have that direct connection, free of an algorithm, with their closest supporters, with their closest fans. And Patreon really enables you to start and build that relationship. And so I can definitely sort of share my screen just to maybe point towards a few highlights of some creator examples. I'll share one example of a pretty sort of notable creator, an ensemble that has sort of millions of fans, sort of a mid-tier creator, someone who's an ensemble and a group that's really found success in sort of their niche community, and then a smaller local community based here in New York that has really been using the platform in such an interesting way. So to start, if you can all see my screen, just to share an example of a group like Pentatonics, right? This is a sort of globally famous ensemble that has sort of millions of fans around the world. And I think what was so interesting about them coming onto Patreon a number of years ago was that sense of, hey, you have such a huge reach. You have so many fans that are attending their shows and buying their music and engaging with them online, but not really having a sense of where the sort of core fans are, really understanding who their demographic is, really understanding who are the folks that are going to be sticking with them for the long term. And so in some ways, they've established a really dynamic membership framework where you have really sort of a low-cost entry-level tier, typically across the board for a lot of creators, sort of starting out at that low, sustainable $5 a month membership, where in a lot of cases, they're offering sort of early access or first looks on new works that you're creating, exclusive behind-the-scenes content. For some creators that have really engaged social followings, the ability to be part of a close friends group on Instagram, or be able to have access to maybe a private patron-only social handle, all the way scaling up to sort of personalized engagements. As you can see with their instance, they had sort of limited availability for $100 a month tier. And as a result, I mean, they're a massive name. Earning $10,000 a month in revenue has been really successful for them. But I think contrasting that with maybe sort of another group, a group that I worked with called Pink Martini, of course, another group that is sort of toured the world, played Carnegie Hall, for instance, played a number of pretty sort of notable venues, and has a really, really engaged audience and social following. Very similarly, in some instances, and in my conversations with them, it was so interesting just being struck by the notion of membership as something that, I mean, folks are familiar, and this is in a U.S. context, and a lot of instances, sort of a New York specific context, but sort of like similar to like PBS pledge drives, NPR pledge drives. They were really, really creative with some of the ideas and benefits that they were offering, being able to offer sort of exclusive merchandise, discounts on their merch stores, sort of exclusive fan club posts, live stream engagements, all sort of spread across a few different price points. And again, being able to sort of target a goal around patrons, and a goal around sort of if there was the ability to sort of house their sort of 350 to 400 of their closest fans and followers. It's been a really successful sort of endeavor for them within this sort of fan club type of a context. But again, these are both examples, I would say, of folks that are pretty well established, have a pretty significant sort of touring history and the ability to really grow a pretty sizable online following. But one sort of ensemble and 501c3 that's based in New York that I just love so much, and I think speaks to the possibilities around sort of more local organizations that are doing more sort of like local regional based work. This is a nonprofit, Coral Chameleon, which also encompasses an ensemble as well as sort of professional development services for sort of musicians and for educators. They launched on Patreon late last year, and very similarly sort of took sort of a broad range of different price points. And in all of these instances, they're pretty low cost, sustainable for the long term. And they did a very interesting way of fusing some of the sort of compositional work that they were doing, but putting it within a membership context. So they had live stream performances of new works that they were producing, but only those live streams were available to watch on their Patreon. And so they sort of serialized their output in a way that made so much sense for a monthly membership program. And as a result, sort of contrasting that with some of these larger creators, they acquired 97 patrons, and sort of within sort of this spread of averaging about sort of $10 a month on their Patreon, being able to bring in $1,000 a month in extra revenue to help support their work has been pretty transformational in the sense of highlighting a new sort of reliable revenue source that they know they can depend on to help sort of fuel their work. So I think, as you can see, it really runs the gamut across so many different ways of engaging with the platform. And it's all really just dependent on what your own goals are as a creator, what your own sort of goals are for developing your community online, and Patreon being a great way to sustain some of that work financially.
Excellent. Thank you so much, all three of you, for a lot of information. I want to remind people that if you haven't been able to take incredibly extensive notes, it's okay. You can view this seminar online after about a day. We just get it up online until June the 30th. You can go back and watch it over and over again. Use the same link that you got in order to get into the seminar and watch it, take notes, all you like. So we are ready for a Q&A session. Quite a number of people have asked some really good questions. I'm going to just start with this is an interesting question from Mauro. What is the least risky funding program in terms of getting audited? I think I might send that to Daniel.
I think in the end, I think you're going to find that almost all of them are fairly stringent around their financials. Most of these organizations, as granting or funding organizations, are where the funding is sourced from. There's going to be accountability on the other end. I've always approached applications to funds at whatever level that I've been involved at in terms of the applying, in terms of whether it's a high level grant or a low level grant or loan, with the idea that it's, you know, if the CRA can look at it, they might want to look at it too. And so I would always exercise the highest fiduciary responsibility. Assume that none will audit, or sorry, expect none will audit, and assume they all might, would be my best advice on that.
And from like an artist perspective, we have, I think I've received through the things that I've worked on probably 50 or 60 grants, and I have yet to be audited. I'm knocking on all the wood that exists. There are grants that have much more difficult financial considerations to get through. Perfect examples are grants that require your organization to have certain statuses. There's a question about that later. So things like if you have a corporation, they usually have higher audit requirements. And the whole of Factor as an organization their reporting requirements are extremely high. They require three-way matches on all of your receipts. That means you have to have the invoice, you have to have the receipt, and you have to have the payment proof, so the canceled check image that goes along with that, or receipt through your credit card company or whatever payment system you used. That's very hard to remember to get if it's your first time. All of the grant agencies will be relatively lenient with you your first time through, but you will have to get it right eventually, and sometimes they will reject and ask you to go back and ask your providers for things, and I've had that happen as well. So please make sure you have as much proof as you can. One other mistake that you might make for some grant organizations is on tour, it's often difficult, depending on where you are in the world. Like when I've toured to Japan a few times. Japan, they tend to have handwritten receipts and they're all in Japanese. Make sure you get those translated and then paste that receipt onto a piece of paper with the translation of that receipt and what currency was in when you paid for it, and then use that currency conversion on the date you paid for it in order to do further grant reporting, because they will want to know that, and it will be an important piece of the puzzle. So there are similar audit requirements for most of them, except for the ones where you have to be a corporation, not for profit or charity. And Factor has the most, and they're the worst, but they're great. They're a fantastic organization. It's just a lot of work to do the reporting.
I'm also going to address the word audit, because there's a difference between an audited financial statement and a notice to reader. So if you are working with it's generally less than about $200,000 budget, you can get a simple notice to reader from your accountant, which is not expensive. If you are looking at a much higher budget range, each organization will tell you what it is, but it's around the $200,000 mark. They will require an actual audited statement, and it's $5,000 or $6,000 to hire an auditor to do that. But for most organizations, especially groups, you just need to get a bookkeeper to prepare a notice to reader and an accountant to sign off on it.
But that is only relevant for Ontario Creates, though. Almost no other grant requires a notice to reader. For reference, guys, notice to reader is simply a financial statement that highlights your incomes and expenditures from previous years for the organization. It's essentially your own budget, but with an accountant's fine-tooth comb. Very few grants require that, but the ones that do, you actually have to get it right. Otherwise, they will simply reject you for insufficient information or missing components. I've had that happen a couple of times. It's very frustrating, particularly when your project is right in the crosshairs of what they're doing, and a procedural error prevents you from continuing.
I would just add too that, usually these second looks at applications passed from the past, they go back. It's a random draw. A lot of it is simply just they are doing their protocol to make sure they are above board with their financiers. Just like random audits that the CRA would send out within sectors, just doing their due diligence and a lot of times it's about due diligence on their funding model. Are they successfully seeing where the money's spent, and how is it being reported, and is it being reported and captured correctly and recorded correctly on both sides, both the funder side and the fund receiver side, or the grant receiver side.
Thank you. Okay, next question from Janet. Is it important to be incorporated or set up as a specific entity? What if the group is not registered, even as a not-for-profit? Is funding available to those kinds of artists?
I can take that because I have artists, or I worked at organizations that are both corporations, that are charities, that are not-for-profits, and that are nothing. There is funding for all of those. They just have different programs. So, for instance, you can't go after Ontario Creates unless you are a corporation. You can't go after Can Export unless you're a corporation, which is why I mentioned them in sort of like the afterthought. But a lot of grant organizations are happy with unincorporated collectives. That's what it is. You're just a bunch of people coming together to make music. And that's totally fine. CCA, TAC, OAC, so your sort of three levels of governmental organizations are totally fine with that. Anything more stringent, Factor, Ontario creates, so can, as well as individual registered members. But those have more organizational requirements. Make sure you take a look at the eligibility requirements. Once again, that was one of those things that I went through. Eligibility requirements says who this funds, and you're looking for unincorporated collective. That's very common. Almost all programs that are, if you're starting out, almost all programs are going to be fine for you in that capacity. Only certain ones require that you're there. Charities, Dan, you might be able to speak with that. There's a not-for-profit and charities. There's a whole different tier of things that I don't know how many people are actually going to get into that space at this point. But also, that's more for organizations and artists. Artists are not often charities. Even organizations. There's also one more thing to note is that there are a couple of interesting language things that need to be clarified. A not-for-profit and operating on a not-for-profit basis mean different things. One is that you are a registered nonprofit. The other means that the directors of the company do not take dividends from said company for simply having directorship. So your owners can't pay themselves for owning it. That's operating on a not-for-profit basis. A nonprofit is a different designation. So this is fine as long as you're not paying yourself to own the company. If you're paying yourself for services, that's fine, but as long as you're not taking dividends. So there's some things to know about that.
The idiosyncrasies you brought up there, of course, get more complex when you add in the idea of a registered charity versus, right? And so one of the things that there are many arts groups that seek funding to raise money for other not-for-profit charitable organizations, and that's well-intentioned, and it's a good community-based kind of creative approach to generating work. I would suggest that on that level, you put in the call to one of the people at the funding body that you're applying to, because there's not only might there be implications around the ability to possibly fund it, you'll want to get the clearance on that from the organization itself. It's a complex matter, and I wouldn't advise ever doing it without speaking directly to the funding body themselves. And then on the other side of that, there are tax implications around that. Anytime an arts organization looks to raise money for other organizations. And so I think at that point you want to seek professional accounting advice as it relates to your financial situation and interaction with a not-for-profit or a charity, some sort of registered charity, in terms of, we're going to put this on and we're going to give you some of the money. I would caution you on both those fronts to just make sure to do your due diligence.
Thank you. Helen asks, how do the grant and loan programs compare and contrast with publishing deals and record deals? I think I'd like to throw that to Dan.
Yeah, this is an interesting question. I mean, it really comes down to ownership. For a record deal or a publishing deal, that is a way to get money. That is a way that a company will say, here's some money for us to work with you and for you to pursue your art or your creations. But that comes with a caveat, and that caveat is you will be compelled to give up something in terms of ownership. And there are both pros and cons with that. I mean, depending, again, on your level of audience and where you're at, what level of control is applied through that ownership in terms of how you're able to promote what you do, what you're able to release. I worked for Canada's largest independent record label, and we stayed completely out of the artistic process for the most part. The artists delivered the albums to us, and it was our job to figure out how to market them and what to do. But if you are at a certain level where you're driving product to commercial radio, there's much more input from the company, and that's part and parcel with the deal. The funding organizations lay out exactly what that relationship is in terms of, we're not going to tell you what to do. You've told us how you're going to create the art. You've told us what the outcome you're aiming to seek and what you're trying to do, and you've told us how much you need. But be aware, many arts funding bodies in the modern age do have sets of community standards. That is, they will tell you right up front, if we believe that this would cross a line in terms of acceptable community standard, we reserve the right to say no. We reserve the right to possibly back out. There is a fine line there. And often when it gets crossed, there is a blow up within the industry sector between the arts community and funding bodies. But that is relative to where the money, you have to keep in mind where the money comes from for a lot of these organizations. It comes from taxpayers, and taxpayers are a broad group of diverse opinions, and so there is that concern always at play. But I want to throw this question to Tom, because the one thing that I was really curious about, talking about this question of comparing record deals and publishing deals to grants and loans, there is no, one has some form of ownership exchange within a legal contract, where funds and grants don't have that. To be fair, though, just to be clear, certain loans and grants may have payback out of sales. This goes back a number of years, and I don't know if it's still in place, but Factor had a program where you got a loan to make an album, and out of every unit sold, you had to pay back $1 out of every unit sold.
Yeah, they actually recently took that program out. It was just crazy. I tried to give them a check for Countermeasure's latest album. They were like, "Nah, man, you don't get that. You have to give it anything." And I was like, "Wait, but I've been paying you for all these years for all the other albums." They're like, "Nah, we changed it like 2 years ago. No problem." Which is not what anyone at Factor sounds like, but it was nice of them. They just get to keep all the money.
That's perfect, and so I'd be curious to have Tom kind of explain what the relationship is between, in terms of financial responsibility or financial transaction, between the artists using the platform, connecting to their communities, and how that flows.
For sure. Yeah. I mean, I think in terms of and I'll preface this by saying that this is such an evolving conversation, especially with so many sort of new music specific signups joining the platform, because historically I would say for a lot of creators on Patreon, it was sort of independent artists that sort of minus any sort of record or publishing agreements that they had, were able to sort of share their music or share any sort of multimedia content on their Patreon without much complexity. But obviously with so much new signups in the music space, it's becoming more of a sort of nuanced conversation. I think primarily what, at least, and I would say somewhat transparently, that Patreon, absent an algorithm or absent any sort of like automated tracking systems or royalty or publishing payout systems, that the platform is really well set up to invite musicians specifically to think sort of outside the box in some instances, outside of music itself. I think live streaming and even going so far as to say like merchandise or other sort of benefit types that are not bound by any outside agreements tend to be able to be more easily offered as sort of an exchange on a membership program. But that being said, I mean, I think especially, at least with my experience working with some musicians that maybe have record deals set up, I think for some labels, more independent labels than majors, have been able to be a bit lenient with musicians, especially last year, with being able to maybe share music like early releases on Patreon, or any sort of unreleased tracks that were sort of predating any contract or agreements they had set up. But in a lot of those instances, creators are sort of thinking outside of any like existing agreements, and for any like management or agent relationships that they have, typically those agents are sort of handling any of the financial transactions on their Patreon, and then sort of paying out artists after whatever percentage deal they've agreed to. But yeah, I mean, that being said, definitely an area in which we're having a lot of conversations every day, and trying to make sure that that we're getting artists paid fairly, and especially on the royalty front, equitably as well.
Yeah, actually, Tom, I have a question. I have a question for you. I apologize to preempt some other audience questions, but I'm interested in the relationships or expectations. As you say, it's an evolving field, of artist management and Patreon. Are artists using Patreon subscribership to find new inroads into justifications for record deals? Are record deals coming with stipulations for Patreon involvement? For releases, is there any sort of evolving hybrid models that are you're finding, because you're like a primary source for audience interaction for artists who are trying to justify investment because of audience interaction?
For sure. I mean, it's a great point, because I think we've definitely seen this more so and just to answer the question around like uh, sort of networks or folks that are building in Patreon components or membership components of any agreements. We've seen that a lot more, I would say, in like the podcasting space. Obviously, the music industry is very old and doesn't really move very quickly. So I think there's a lot of entrenched sort of notions of record deals and agreements with labels, and so those conversations are very active. And I think it's sort of an emerging category for labels specifically. But yeah, I mean, I think for a lot of managers, like management companies, folks that I know we work with, colleagues at like Red Light, for instance, on the music side, and they've been super supportive in onboarding their talent as just an additional supplemental revenue stream that they're able to build out. And similarly with any like agency relationships, being able to make sure that folks are sort of compensated for their work in referring and helping support the onboard process for creators and musicians.
Thank
Cool,
you.
thanks.
Actually, I have a question from Vanessa for Tom, talking about the audience. With being able to download all followers' names and phone numbers and emails, how do you make sure that Patreon doesn't just sell these lists?
So yeah, I mean, it's an excellent question, and to clarify, I don't know if it was a question of like Patreon selling a list or a creator selling a list.
Either one, Patreon or a creator.
Yeah, I mean, on Patreon standpoint, we don't share or sell any data. Again, like really building against sort of conventional social media platforms and companies that have a tendency to do that. We put creators in full control, and to that point, being able to download that data, there isn't really anything that we can do to stop creators from downloading their audience lists and moving off platform. I think the thing that we always stress is that that with Patreon as a membership platform, and really the core of what we do is processing recurring payments. That's really like the foundational element of the platform, outside of like content posting and community tools and relationship management tools. I think the payment processing piece is crucial. And we always say, if you want to go and build a payments processing system on a monthly basis on your own website, like by all means, we want to empower creators to be able to do that. But I think we're really confident in the tools that we've built for creators to use, and it takes a huge load off of their shoulders to have to manage chargebacks and declines and fraud and security and all of the elements that go into all of that. And we have a whole team dedicated to do that on behalf of creators. So, but yeah, I mean, again, the core mission is to put power back in the hands of the creators themselves, and we would welcome any use of their own data.
Yeah, boy, I can't imagine trying to manage all that stuff on your own. Listen, all we want to do is make music and reach fans. Like, why would you build a payment system? That's not your gig. That's cool. Thanks for sharing.
I have a question here from Bhavani. I'm part of a nonprofit group where the music song releases we do go to assist soldiers, and create a bursary for high school students based on a play we are working on. The rest of the songs for the play are in the process of being written. Our not-for-profit is only 2 years old, so we have only applied for our first OAC grant. Would the grants you mentioned apply to us? John Michael, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that there is a ton of stuff that would apply to you from there. One caveat that I would say is if you're in the process of writing songs, a lot of grants will not fund things you are already doing. So you need to apply for the things you want to do prior to starting the thing you want to do. Now, you don't have to finish the thing, or it doesn't. If you've started up, you haven't finished it, you can sometimes apply for like in-flight stuff, but all expenses incurred after the application date are eligible. Expenses occurred before the application was submitted are not eligible for payment by grants. So just to know that, that's why, as I said, you usually want multiple kicks at the can before you start your project if you're planning on getting funding. In terms of the organization structure as a not-for-profit, I think that almost all of the grants I talked about would be applicable to you in some capacity. Once again, only funding things that are applied or done or paid for after you apply. So that would be things like music commissioning, which would go through Canada Council, through the the concept realization grant, through OAC, through music commissioning, through Toronto Arts Council, through music projects. All three of those would probably work for you if you're in Toronto or in Ontario. And as a note for you, I know I'm Ontario-centric, Toronto-centric. I apologize. That's where I apply for all my grants. But I know like there are very strong arts councils in like British Columbia. Alberta has a really strong arts council. The Maritimes has a really great series of really good arts councils. So you can run across those, look for those in your local areas. So the answer, Bhavani, is yes, absolutely. A lot of what you're doing would be eligible for funding, particularly if you're 2 years old, you have 2 sets of financial statements. If there's ever any question of eligibility, you can submit those to the program officer who's handling your grant. Remember, I showed you, like, Elizabeth Berdukas was the one we pulled up on the left side of the screen there. Call them, email them. They almost always get back to you within like a couple of days. It's usually pretty quick, and they will help to make sure that you're right for it. But I think a couple of years of statements and the fact you're not for profit, I think that's not going to be a problem. In fact, I think it'd be an asset for you in some of the grants you're looking for. And I would very strongly encourage you to apply for that. One other thing I didn't mention before, but I think it's really important to know, is that it could be hard to get your first grant to support a project. That's just the way it is, and that's a shame. It really isn't pleasant. You might have to take a few kicks at the can. Once you get one organization coming on board to support your project. So a perfect example is in 2013, I applied for Countermeasure's second album. I applied for the grants to make that album. And everyone said no. And in 2014, I applied again. Everyone said no. In 2015, I applied, and one person said yes. And in the middle of 2015, I applied again, and 2 more said yes. And so when a little bit of success comes, the other grant organizations tend to pile on. If I've got $5,000, $10,000 from a grant organization, that looks really good on a budget because that money's already confirmed. And then they say, well, you already have 10,000 from here. We could put another 10,000 towards that. And suddenly you've got 20,000 for this project. And the third rate agency said, well, we'll just kick a little more into that. Let's make it 25. And suddenly you've got, that's a bunch of the album funded, if not the whole thing. It's incredible. So once again, the first domino to fall is sometimes the hardest to get. You might have to apply a bunch. I think I applied 12 or 13 times before we got our first dollar in the door. But it was a lot of learning. It was a lot of opportunity to introduce the groups to the funding organizations that we're a serious contender. We're going to keep applying. And then once you get the first thing, the next fall into place. And so, yeah, absolutely do apply and keep applying even if you don't get it, because you're introducing yourself to those granting organizations. Apply at every level. And then soon enough, you'll have the opportunity to accept your first grant and get moving with the funding that you're looking for.
Thank you. We have one more question. I'm just going to say thank you to everybody who's been sticking with us, and do make sure that you check out singtoronto.com for all of the rest of the amazing things that we're doing this week, including tomorrow night's seminar on self-promotion. So Helen asks, if you are starting out as an artist, how best can you grow without large sources of money like grants? Do you require a team very early on to promote yourself, or can you do that independently for a long enough time to grow your fan base? Who would like to take that?
I'll jump in. This is the challenge of the modern artist, unfortunately. Um, JM's made a comment about, who wants to build a pay system? I just want to make music. Um, I have worked with numerous Juno Award-winning artists, and during the transition from the old model of the record/CD business through traditional retail stores, one of their largest complaints was the increased amount of time that they were spending on social media. And it is a challenge. And so I think, unfortunately, for most artists, they all start now without a team. The good news is there's a capability to reach more people from the comfort of your own home than ever before. You can do more with way less staffing and way less financial capability. But the one part of the equation that does not change is time. It still takes time. And so if you look at a number of artists who are finding success right now, they're doing so on their own. They are driving good numbers. I don't think the problem is necessarily finding that audience. I think the problem is sustaining. And this is and I think that's the challenge. And so I tell most creators that I deal with, student-wise or outside, get as much content together as you can before you start trying to put stuff in a pipeline to connect and build audiences. Because if you get a hit, like something takes off online virally through your own self-promotional efforts, and you've got nothing to follow it up with, that might be that could very well be a lost opportunity. And so this to me, I think, is an interesting question, and I want to kind of get Tom's thoughts on it. At whatever level, I think you need really good planning. I was impressed by the choral group you showed, Tom, because clearly they put a lot of thought into it, and they were really smart about it. Like, if I'm ordering 100 hats to sell in my web store, and I commit 100 of them to give away to patrons at a certain level, that's really good planning. Doesn't require a lot of work. And so I think all of that again goes back to this idea of really, you can achieve more with less money, less people, as well as you strategize and plan it out really well. But I'd like to hear Tom's kind of comments on the challenges of that sort of community building aspect of the maintenance piece, because that's another time piece. And I would make the assumption that the ones that seem to be the most successful are the ones that really strategize well in front of it to understand what they're going to do. And I'm assuming that Patreon helps with that process by offering advice and guidance with that approach.
For sure. Yeah, I love this question so much. And I think this might actually be a good lens through my background as a musician. In addition to working at Patreon, I'm also an active touring musician myself, and have played in a number of bands over the years. And I think this is sort of like a side sort of anecdote a little bit, but I think so much of the philosophy, and I think this also kind of aligns with why I ended up working at a company like Patreon, is that a lot of my musical ethos and my musical background comes from sort of like a DIY, do-it-yourself mentality, where I think I grew up in an era where there were so many new tools available to me to make and record music and publish music ultimately, and share it with the internet and share it with my local community, which then grew into a wider sort of regional Northeastern community, which then grew into a national community and grew into a global community. I mean, that took a number of years to get to that point where we were able to sort of have enough of a reach where we could sort of book tours and hit the road and make records and sort of have enough of an audience to sustain that sort of touring schedule. But I think that really speaks to this notion, and something that our CEO, Jack Conte, who I mentioned is a musician himself, always speaks around this idea of working to publish, and being able to say that, I think this sort of runs sort of counter to, I think, a lot of more like established creators and folks typically, I'm thinking of like my Carnegie background of like really meticulous composers and folks that really are refining a work to its like absolute like level of perfection, that I think in the modern age with the internet, that it doesn't really enable you to take that much time to be refining, constantly refining and refining and refining. I think being able to publish and share content, whether it's sort of really well polished or something that's like a live stream performance or a demo or a work in progress, these are all really sort of pieces of content and assets that are at your disposal to share within your Patreon community, your sort of closest, most engaged followers. And I think to Dan's point, it just takes a bit of time to really understand who you are as a creator and really understand what your values are, what excites you, and being able to sort of publish that, and the audience will come as you continue to publish and share your work. And once you've sort of established that level of an audience and considering Patreon to really hone in on like who are the core sort of smaller percentage of those folks that will ultimately sustain your work on a monthly basis, is a really great complement to that sort of wider social engagement.
Thank you so much. This is a lot of information. As I mentioned, you can go back and listen to this seminar anytime until June 30th. Thank you to Tom, to Dan, to JM for giving us so much to chew on and how to finance what it is we do. Just a reminder that we have a whole week ahead of amazing activities at singtoronto.com. And a big thank you to Canadian Musician Magazine and to Longwell Quades for sponsoring this series. Tomorrow night, Self-Promotion 101. If you want to know how to promote your group, Jim Norris, who is the publisher of Canadian Musician Magazine, will be taking you through his best tips on how to promote. So with that, I want to thank you, everybody, for being part of our session tonight. We're here for you. You can always direct further questions at info@singtoronto.com, and we will send them along to all the right people. And Tom has just put his Patreon contact in the chat. So if you want to ask him anything, and the band he's playing with is Oso Oso. So you can get in touch with them there. Again, thank you all for being part of the session, and we'll see you hopefully tomorrow night at our self-promotion event. Have a great night.